Welcome back, guys. In today's video I want to show you a fantastic game which I observed from the Budapest Spring Chess Festival, which has just concluded today. It's quite difficult to keep up with all of the ongoing tournaments. I mean, there was the Prague Chess Festival and many other high-level events which were ongoing, but I tried to stay up to date with all of the major tournaments to follow interesting games, and specifically also to keep up to date with all of the different opening trends. Obviously, maybe I'm working on a new opening idea video, but also for myself, and generally this is what I recommend to any ambitious chess player, is just to follow tournaments and to try to learn from strong players and observe from their games what is happening and what you can learn from that. And it's always nice for me to see that some people are playing the things which I recommend in different courses, and that's actually the main topic of today's video, because in the game I want to show you my recommendation against the Catalan, which I made a modern chess course on that, was played by international master Sidelines, who played against Abdisalimov, a grandmaster. I think they're both from Kazakhstan, but I hope I don't make any mistakes here. Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. Yeah, not 100% sure now. I think it should be Uzbekistan, if I'm not wrong here. Hopefully, yeah, if I'm wrong here, please correct me, but I think it should be from, they are both from Uzbekistan. And Black played my recommendation against the Catalan. I would suggest that we just jump right into it. The game was absolutely chaotic, but it was so interesting to follow. I did not even really check it with the engine. Out of safety, I have an engine running here on a very low depth. Hopefully that I won't embarrass myself and not make any super obvious blunders. And I just want to go through the game together and kind of to deliver my raw reaction to it, because I just briefly skipped through it yesterday and it looked absolutely crazy. And yeah, I thought it would be interesting to check this out together, also considering the fact that I haven't really looked at, so that you can kind of see my first reaction to it, because usually when I record those videos I look at it beforehand and do some preparation, so I thought it would be interesting also to see my unfiltered reaction here. So what we are talking about is the Catalan, knight f3, d5, g3, and my recommendation was to play with bishop e7. Generally, this is quite nice to play this system, because then you also have something against other move orders, like for example against knight f3. So now whenever white plays with g3, you can always play with bishop e7. And obviously white has some other possibilities. They can play, for example, with d3 and knight d2, e4, King's Indian attack, or the double fianchetto, which is also possible, but generally I feel like it's quite a practical system to play with the classical setup with bishop e7 short castle, because it is a little bit easier with all of the move orders. And here a5. This was my recommendation for the modern chess course, and a5 is still quite a big move, I would say. Magnus Carlsen has played it among others, and the idea in general is to make a useful waiting move. Often a5 can be useful, especially if black can go for c6, b6, bishop a6 at some point. And also just gaining space, like at some point a4 could be an idea, especially if white would play with b3 now, then a4 can immediately start some counterplay on the queen side. And for white it's often an idea to play with b3, so that's why it also makes sense to have a5. We are only focusing on queen c2 here, which was played in the game, which I think is more or less the only really critical move. The idea of queen c2 is often that white can go knight d2 and then try to play e4. The same also is in the normal classical closed Catalan with c6. Here white usually goes queen c2 with the idea to play knight d2 and then e4. Just briefly, the idea after knight c3 for black here is to go c6 and now transpose to some sort of closed Catalan and argue that the knight on c3 is not so great, because now white does not have this idea to play queen c2 followed by e4 as nicely, because the pawn on c4 is not protected and black can just take it and try to hold on to it, for example with b5. So queen c2, I think, is the critical move, and my recommendation was the move a4, which is very rare. I had one game against Grandmaster Sargsyan from Armenia in the previous European Championship, where I got a pretty good position out of the opening, but later on blundered and lost. And before that, there were only a handful of games, Magnus being one of the people who played that. I think Magnus had it in some online game, or it was definitely a shorter time control, so wasn't honestly sure if it was his preparation or if he was just freestyling over the board. But anyway, it was interesting to see that he played it, and then I had a closer look at it, and it looked quite interesting, and then I decided to recommend this move. We're just gaining more space on the queen side. The main move before that was knight c6, which has more of a concrete idea to play knight b4, which is objectively also playable, but I did not really like the fact in general to put this knight here. White should go a3 to stop knight b4, and now black's idea is to continue like this, and black has ideas with bishop d7, knight a5, then trying to occupy this square or push c5 at some point. As I said, it's also playable, but I thought it would be more interesting to recommend a4, which was also played in the game which we are looking at. Funny story on the side, also in the Graz Open, which finished like 2 weeks ago, I think, I also saw someone who played this line from the black side. And I think the same person also played some other lines which I recommended in some other YouTube videos, which is always nice for me to see. Obviously, I never know if any of the players actually watch my videos or if they're just coming up with the ideas themselves. But still, I don't know. There is a chance that they might be checking it, and it feels really good for me to see that very strong players might take some inspirations from the ideas which I'm publishing. In that game, bishop f4 was played, and black actually won, even though he was the underdog, which was also the case from the game between the two players from Uzbekistan, which we're having a look at. Bishop f4 was played in that game. D takes c4, queen takes c4, knight d5, and this is how it went. Bishop d2, knight d7. It's often the idea after bishop f4 to take and then to use this tempo on the bishop with knight d5 in many of the different lines. e4, knight f6, knight c3, and now b5. This is how the game continued, and white immediately, who was a grandmaster, Nico Chasin was white, continued with knight takes b5, which immediately gave black the initiative. After bishop a6, it was quite difficult for him to keep everything protected on this diagonal. Queen b8 came next, and black won a pretty nice game in the end. But in the game, rook d1 was played, which I think is also the critical move. At least it says so in my file. And now knight d7. This was the idea. I think that there are still, almost no games here. I did not check the online database before, but when I last checked it, all of that was super rare. Maybe just a handful of games with knight d7. The idea is that black still wants to keep the c-pawn flexible, so that if white plays knight d2 here, then we can still counter with c5. Because if black would start with c6, now knight d2, and then if knight d7, then e4, this could become pretty passive for black. Like something like this is usually what white really wants to achieve in the Catalan. The bishop on c8 is now very passive. White has a nice center, and black does not have really many attractive pieces, many attractive squares for his pieces. Yeah, so that's the point of knight d7. By the way, if white starts with knight d2, here black can get a great version from the earlier line with knight c6, because now the knight on d2 is misplaced. And if now a3, black doesn't even need to take in those lines on c4 and can immediately try to get in knight a5, which gives black a great version just for understanding. Yeah, so this is how the game continued. Knight c3, also the critical move, so I'm sure that white was also familiar with this line. Sacrificing the pawn on c4, but then playing for activity and also for compensation. Knight e5. This was still covered in my course. This was actually the main line, because it was one of the critical lines of this whole system. And now knight b6, which I thought was the most practical. Computer also says that knight takes e5 might even be a bit better objectively speaking, but I did not really like this type of position. White has some ideas with knight g5, sometimes to start an attack over there. If c6, then the knight can jump into d6. This didn't feel so practical to me. So knight b6, just holding on to the pawn on c4. in the game, white played a3, stopping black from getting a3 himself, which would launch pretty serious counterplay on the queen side. And now black played knight e8, which was still my recommendation in the course. I think it's also the top move of the engine. At this point, I also analyzed knight fd7 to try to get some material off the board, and some ideas with rook a5 are often there in this line just to activate the rook on the 5th rank. When the position also seemed playable for me, bishop d7, maybe at some point f6 to activate the queen on this diagonal. Also looked pretty solid for black, but obviously white has pretty good compensation as well. Yeah, so knight e8 is what I gave. The idea is to put the knight to d6 to hold on to the pawn on c4 even better. And also at some point to try to get rid of the knight on e5 by playing f6 sooner or later. Now white continued with e4, knight d6. And here white played the move queen e2, which I did not analyze in the course anymore. I did look at one I thought which was the most logical move, bishop e3, when my recommendation continued with f6, knight f3 and bishop d7 with those type of ideas. Play king h8, queen e8, queen h5 next. And also sometimes ideas with rook a5 could be there. This is what I wrote in the text. King h8 sometimes is a logical move. And my conclusion was that white definitely has sufficient compensation, but it's not so obvious also how he can now immediately make use of it, because whichever pawn he pushes in the center might also have some drawbacks. If he goes e5, then the knight has the nice square in f5, and also this diagonal is going to open up for the bishop. And also at some point the f-file could open up for the rook on f8. And if d5 comes, then black, could even think about just closing everything with e5. And then it's not so clear really where the compensation is. And maybe at some point black can try to counter with c6 or just keep everything solid here. Maybe try to get in f5 at some point. But here it's really not so obvious what white is really playing for. I could even imagine that the position is playable for black without the pawn on c7. So here black does seem to have an extra pawn. Yeah, white played queen e2 in the game, which I did not analyze in the course even further. But queen e8 was played, which looks like a nice move. Just trying to get f6 in on the next move. I guess he can also start with that immediately. Probably doesn't matter as much. After queen e8, just stepping out of the d-file, he prepared f6. White played bishop e3, f6. Now the knight has to go back to f3, bishop d7. By the way, just an information here, I see that position now is objectively completely equal. Yeah, white still has compensation, but definitely not more than that. Knight d2 now was played, and knight b5. Here, while I was checking the game, black's next move surprised me a little bit. Knight b5 maybe still not so much. It was okay. King h8 to me feels like now, if I'm reacting to it just quickly, seems like a move which black can also play fairly automatically. Still, it's not so simple for black now which pawn break to go for. Now, since the knight has moved away from f3, I would be looking at perhaps e5 at some point. Also, I still like this idea of rook a5. To try to activate the rook. I guess that black's idea was to try and step out of white's idea with e5, but it's not so clear to me if it's really a threat. Because, okay, b7 might be hanging, but then the b-file could open up. And as we discussed earlier, e5 also has some drawbacks. Maybe knight f5, bishop takes b7 and rook b8. When maybe black could take the bishop pair, open up the e-file, and open up the f-file, and then try to use the b-file for himself. But I guess this was black's idea to step out of e5. Knight e2 was played. Yeah, hard to say for me. Rook ac1 is the best move according to the computer here. I guess black's idea was to take. Rook takes c3, and now, I don't know, something. Maybe bishop b5, like in the game, which was also played just hanging on to the pawn on c4, when it's also not so clear how white can proceed now. So knight a2, trying to keep the tension. Black went back to d6, inviting a repetition of moves. Objectively speaking, e5 is even working here well, but I can understand why not to go for that. In general, also c4 is hanging, like I don't really understand. Knight takes c4 here, what is even the point? You can just take and go rook f7. Another funny move which is suggested is bishop g4, but all of that does not seem necessarily human to me. Maybe e takes d4 is possible, yeah. And then this also seems fine for black now that you see it. If you get the bishop pair, bishop has a nice square on c5. Also seems fairly comfortable for black. Bishop on c5 is really strong. But yeah, he went back to d6, also a good move objectively speaking, and now f4 was played. And here I was a little bit surprised to see the move bishop b5 played. He is holding on to the pawn on c4, but I really did not like the fact that he's putting the bishop on a6. Of course, now whenever white moves the knight on c3, then c3 is a big idea. But to me, it seemed like the bishop on a6 is a little bit strange. It's not really doing so much. I did not think much about some other alternatives. I don't know, bishop c6, maybe I'm blundering something here, but it looks natural to me. Maybe to prepare f5 on the next move. It's not the best move in the position. Now it's around equal. The engine claims that immediately f5 is possible. And after e5, just knight d to c8, just giving up the pawn on b7. And if white takes, rook b8, bishop, let's say, back to g2. And then knight d5 is an important move, giving away another pawn on c4. But I would assume that if white takes, he might have some issues with bishop b5 to come. Yeah. And it's actually impossible for white now that I look at it, to break the pin, because knight b6 is a huge threat, and if he tries to unpin, then black can take and then take on e3, which is winning a piece. So f5 was an interesting move, but not so obvious to see, especially going back to c8. But if black has time to maybe exchange his bishop and then to put the knight to d5, then even strategically speaking, black is much better. Okay, bishop b5 was played. As I said, I was not a huge fan of this move. Still, the position is playable. Now black is maybe a little bit worse. White continued with g4, going for the 4 pawns attack here. Not the best move, objectively speaking, once again. Hard for me to say now what, I mean, if I'm thinking now, e5 seems like it could be quite similar to what we had earlier. I guess black's idea was to go knight b5 here. Does not look convincing for white to me. d5 is another possible central breakthrough. He takes d5, maybe bishop takes b6, knight d5. Ah, there's also c3 there. Bishop b6, cb6, knight d5, c3. Does not look good for white. Was that correct? Yeah, here black is winning. So e takes d5, white should continue here. Yeah, still very unclear position. d5, is it the best move? Yeah, probably d5 or knight. Yeah, knight f3 might also make some sense. And after knight b5, bishop h3, okay. I think also that white's position is not so easy to play here. Because he has so many different chances to break through, either e5 or d5 or at some point f5, which white went for later in the game. But all of that does have some drawbacks. Like with d5, you're sort of also exchanging a little bit off of your space advantage and opening up the e-file, which could also favor black at some point. Black actually has a nice idea here, f5 followed by bishop f6, which is pretty cool, just to activate the bishop there. Generally, the position is still very much unclear. White played g4 here. Now knight b5. This was a good idea, and probably in general what black was trying to achieve when putting the bishop to a6. So maybe I was a little bit harsh with this idea to put the bishop on a6, because he did have the concrete idea to try to get rid of the knight on c3 by playing knight b5 next. Now f5 was played. E takes f5 and g takes f5. And now black played c5. And in this stage of the game, while I was browsing through the game on Lichess, I was looking at the live engine, black completely outplayed white here. And c5 was the start of it, which was a very nice strategical idea, which basically forces white to play d5 now. And now black has a very nice control over all of the dark squares. Bishop will come to d6 next, e5 square is weak, and on top of that, black has the nice d4 square for the knight. So coming back to this position, f5 probably makes things a little bit worse here. But, I mean, maybe knight f3 anyway. Because allowing knight takes c3, I guess that white can live with that, as long as black does not get c3 himself. a3 can be a weakness here, but at least the queen side is going to be closed for now, and maybe white can try to continue with f5 after that. Yeah, c5 was a nice move. If white takes the pawn. I guess the idea was to go back knight d7, but I think you have to take first so that c4 is covered. Take, and now knight d7. Yeah, that is the idea, and then black can take the pawn on c5 next, and then perhaps the knight can even jump into d3 next. Yeah, so d5, knight d4, queen f2, bishop d6. Knight f3 was played. I don't think that white should take here in general. I mean, maybe it even feels tactically, because it might be pretty difficult to stop bishop c5, like after a move like rook c8, for example. Bishop c5 is coming, or even knight d7. But even in the long term, I don't think that white really wants to give up the dark squared bishop, because all of the dark squares will be very, very weak. Knight f3, probably the best chance. Queen h5, another good move, as it looks like, activating the queen and also increasing the pressure on h2. So therefore, white cannot really comfortably take here, because then at the end of the line, h2 is hanging. So white played h4, covering that pawn. Knight b3, also the best move, hitting the rook on a1. So rook b1 was played, rook a e8, targeting the pawn on e4, bishop h3, and knight d7. Yeah, that was also a nice move. Looking at the position, it's very chaotic, but black realized that the knight on b6 is not really doing anything, and he wants to improve it and played knight d7. And also it's going to facilitate b5, b4, which also happened in the game soon after that. So that was a nice move. King h1, preparing rook g1. b5, as I said, this was black's idea. Anyway, rook g1 came. King h8, stepping out of the g file. I guess you could also start with b4 first, but I think it's to some extent, it's also a human decision to just immediately step out of the g file first, and b4 is not really running away, I would say. Bishop g4, queen f7, queen g2. Now actually setting up a threat of bishop h5, like if black goes b4 here, I could imagine that bishop h5 could be a little bit unpleasant, because you cannot take due to checkmate on g7. I guess you can still give the exchange somehow like this, but yeah, there's no reason to allow that. So black went rook e7 first, because now if bishop h5 comes, then the pawn on g7 is protected. So white cannot go for that here. White played h5. By the way, at this point already for the last few moves, black is winning. But okay, in a practical game, it's not so easy yet, because white has definitely some chances for an attack, especially with h5. He has one idea, either to play h6, or even more dangerous, what white chose in the game was knight h4, knight g6. So even though black is winning here, according to the engine, in a practical game, it's still not easy by any means. And later on, the position was again unclear at some point. So b4, black has to start some counterplay on the queen side, where he is also stronger. He has 4 pawns against 2 there. So b4, white went knight h4 here, just leaving the knight on c3, because if he leaves with the knight, then I could imagine that the pawn on e4 can just be captured by the rook from e7. Like, I don't know, if knight e2, for example, I guess rook takes e4 just works here. And maybe white has some discovered attacks with knight g5, but even here, after taking, I mean, now white's attack has sort of come to a stop. Maybe bishop b7 is also quite unpleasant, going after the d5 pawn. And yeah, okay, I'm seeing here position is -5. Wouldn't have guessed that, but it sort of makes sense. So knight h4, the best practical try and also the best objective try, as I see. B takes c3, and now knight g6 check. And black cannot take here, so black and went king g8. If he takes, then there's going to be a disaster happening on the h file. It's unstoppable. Queen h3 check, followed by queen h7 with checkmate. Unless black gives the queen, which he also doesn't want to do. So black went king g8. Now h6, again, probably the best try in this position. If you just take the exchange, then, okay, at this point, I'm not sure how black can recapture, maybe with the king, trying to run over there. But it doesn't seem like, well, maybe now h6. I don't know how I'm going to take back. Perhaps with the queen, it's also possible, so that my knight then can jump to e5. I just believe that without the knight, it's going to be much more difficult for white to do something. Like if b takes c3, maybe just a move like h6, king can go to h8 next, knight comes to e5, and black even has 2 pieces for the rook. I'm just realizing now, which is even a lot of material. Yeah, so h6, nice practical try, and here black took h takes g6, which is not the best move according to the engine. Computer is just calmly taking on b2, which, yeah, does not strike me as an easy thing to do. If rook takes b2, I assume that at some point the c pawn could start to be unpleasant. c3 is the best move, although I did... if rook c2, there's bishop d3. That's the point. Yeah, bishop d3 now, attacking the rook and also the pawn on e4. But of course, it begs the question, like if hg7, then, I mean, what does black do? Because queen g7 opens up the g file, and here already white is winning. Knight takes c7 check, and if I take back with the bishop, just moving the queen somewhere, for example here, and then moving with the bishop, there's going to be a lot of trouble on the g file. So computers claim you can just move the rook anywhere on the 8th rank. Rook e8 is the best of them, also the most logical, and here black is winning because this pawn on g7 actually works as sort of a shield for the black king. Since the g file now is closed, it's going to be more difficult for white to start doing something there. e4 is going to drop next, and black should be winning. Yeah, but very difficult. Also, I can imagine that both players were already pretty low on time at this point. So black took another piece on g6. H takes g6, and now queen e8. If he takes here, then bishop e8, bishop e6 is a problem, and then the queen of g6 is going to fall. So he went back to e8. White took on g7, rook takes g7 now. And here the fun starts. Bishop e6, and black has to sacrifice the queen. Now all of a sudden the position is completely unclear. And I guess that at some point, I mean, there were many interesting moments in this game to just take a moment and use it as a calculation exercise. But I'm not sure yet at which exact point this would be the best for calculation. Maybe here it could be an idea after h6, how to react at this point. Just coolly taking on b2. And also here after hg7, rook takes g7 was in fact a mistake. The best move is knight d4. Don't ask me why. I mean, you're just giving the rook on f8. I'm also like, what exactly is the point if I just take on c3? What am I missing? And now rook g7. You're covering the e6 square. That's the whole point. And now if c takes d4, there's f5, again, the only move. Bishop takes f5, rook f5, and then e3 is hanging, I assume. Yeah, and black is winning. So knight d4 would have been strong here. What a move, yeah, just protecting e6. And if white takes here, what is then? Because c takes d4, then again, bishop e6 is going to be a possibility at some point. Queen h3 first. It's actually also a nice move, only winning move. Threatening queen h7 mate, and if rook g7, then there's bishop e6, winning the queen again. So if bishop takes d4, now king takes g7, and then rook h8 is coming on the next move, and it's probably white, the one who's going to get checkmated. And okay, now finally, I'm also starting to understand why not king takes g7 first, because then white has bishop h6 check. And if you take back, assume there's going to be some mate on black's king, because if king g7, there's queen h7. And okay, if this, there should be some very simple solution. I guess this is the easiest route to checkmate. Also, bishop f5 is going to be over. So knight d4 has the idea to lure the bishop away from this diagonal, so that after bishop takes d4, then there is king takes g7. And okay, the best move still in this position is queen h3. And now rook takes g7. This is the line which is given. Bishop takes d4. Now queen takes e4 is the only move, because again, if c takes d4, bishop e6 is coming. Queen takes e4. Bishop f3, only way to block the check. And now you can either repeat moves with this, bishop g4, queen e4, or try to play on like this and sacrifice the queen here like this. Take on d3 and take on d4. Which leads to a completely unclear position. The engine says minus 0.40. I guess it's a draw if you let it run for some time. But I guess chances for both sides, yeah. This is what I like to say if I have no idea what's going on. Chances for both sides, yeah. Interesting variation. But knight d4 is the best here, after some depth. But rook takes g7 was played, which also led to a lot of fun. Bishop e6 check, and here black sacrificed the queen. D takes e6. And now knight to e5. Which gives white now a big advantage if he would have played rook b to d1, immediately attacking the bishop on d6. Still, black is also not lost here. Bishop b7 first would have been even stronger to immediately try to get f5, which black later on in the game managed to do, because this bishop on b7 is actually very strong on this diagonal, because both the king and the queen are lined up on this diagonal. And after e takes d7, then f5. How does it continue? Rook b to f1. What is the point of that? Bishop takes e4, you take on... you have d8 queen in the end. Bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, take on f8, and then white is queening on the next move, and white is winning. Okay, so rook b to f1. And I was wondering, why not this rook? Because then you can take with the rook on d7. And I guess if you have the other rook on g1 still, then there's g7 here. Let's check that. Rook b to f1, rook takes d7. Yeah, g7 is one of the ideas now. And then queen h3, and okay, it also goes on, but here it's, yeah, actually black has to go for rook takes d7 here. It's the only move, and now, for example, g7 looks logical to me. Rook f7, queen h3, bishop takes e4, you have to block with this rook. And the funny thing is you shouldn't even take on f3 to keep the threat alive. Take on g7 first. White needs to take on c3. And again, it continues somehow. Actually, I like black here because all of the bishops look so strong, but as you can imagine here, it's 0.00. Yeah, knight e5 was played. Okay, it's also a good practical move, I think, because after bishop b7, it's at least sort of obvious for white that he should probably take on d7, and the pawn on d7 is a little bit of a nuisance after that. Okay, knight e5. As I said, white should go for rook d1 here. It would be interesting to know what was black's idea here. Engine suggests knight d2 here. Bishop takes d2. By the way, if b takes c3, there's knight takes e4. And if queen takes e4, there's bishop b7, which then probably leads to a drawish endgame. Same material on the board, both sides have 4 pawns. g6 can be weak, this pawn is at least not going anywhere, knight on e5 is nicely centralized, e6 is probably falling as well, so this is one of the lines which is given, for example, black can take on e6 next, and objectively it should be a draw. But white had some other chance here, bishop takes d2, c takes d2, rook takes d2, and now bishop to e7 maybe? And it goes on. Maybe white is not even clearly better here. Queen h3, bishop b7, queen f5 to cover the e4 pawn. Now rook d7 might be a threat at some point, even though it could still take. That's also not so easy to say. What is actually white threatening here? By the way, a small trick for you guys if you're using ChessBase. Maybe I'm going to make a separate video on that. But if you want to see what is your opponent's threat, then you can just press X while you have the engine running, and then it acts sort of as a nil move, as a zero move, and then you can see what would decide who is not to move, which move it would make, and in that case it's rook h2. I considered that, but I still did not really see the threat after this point, because if then the queen moves, then e4 is hanging. I thought, like if black just waits here, just rook h6 and slowly building up. Rook h6 and then queen h5 is coming, and then h8, there's going to be rook h8 mate, which is going to be difficult to avoid. So for that reason, black needs to play rook d8 here, so that if rook h2 now, there is rook d4, with counterplay against the pawn on e4. And this is the best line now. White should take on d8, rook d1, knight d3, to cover the d file again, and again, probably a draw. If you're curious, computer says like 0.50 here on a pretty low depth, and just more or less suggests waiting around. Maybe there could be an idea. Okay, the bishop should probably go to e7 next, and then bishop c6, bishop e8 to try and put pressure on g6. Still, black is not lost or anything. I mean, really, anything could happen here. But white played b takes c3. And now bishop e7 gained in even more strength, because now f5 is a really serious threat, and white had a hard time to find something against that. He played rook bd1, which is still okay, knight e3. But here he had to find an only move, which is rook g to e1. And if f5, then I guess he can move the bishop to h6, and now e4 is covered. Still, it's, I mean, it goes on, yeah? Also, okay, does black have to go f5, or is there even something better? All moves are zeros here at this point. f5 looks very natural. Here, and I can take on e1 first as well. Rook takes e1, f5. Yeah, the thing is, I wasn't even sure if I want to get rid of my knight on d3 because it looked so nice there. Guys, you won't even guess what is the best move here for white. I mean, that's unbelievable. Knight c1. Going to a square which is 2 times protected. Obviously, the rook cannot take because of bishop takes e4. And the idea is just to improve the knight to d3 again. And what happens if I just take with the bishop? Is then rook f6 an idea or what? Yeah, rook f6, yeah. And now white cannot take on g7. Black takes on g6 next, and white's king is in a lot of trouble. I guess this is also a pretty good exercise, yeah. For any of your students. F takes e4 is also playable, by the way. Bishop g7, king g7. And okay, it also continues, yeah. Probably around equal as well. But knight c1 is a fantastic move at this position. Okay, black could also play this, but then bishop h6, and an incredible material constellation here. Black has 4 minor pieces for a rook and a full queen. And still the position is equal. And it's not even like black has some immediate checkmate threats. It's just more or less pure domination by the pieces on the board. And it seems like white has to be fairly careful not to lose. Like one sample line here is queen h2, an important move. Otherwise, white is significantly worse. King takes g6, important. White can still not take on f5. And it goes on now. And it goes on. What a game. Anyway, white played rook df1 here, which did not really do anything against the threat of f5. At least it did not work out for him. Bishop h6 was probably his plan, but yeah, bishop takes e4 just worked. And I'm not sure what white specifically missed here. Maybe that was still his idea. But black could play bishop e5 here, but even stronger, maybe that was one of the moves which white missed, was knight f2, which is very unpleasant. King cannot go to h2 because the bishop is covering that square. And if king g2, then rook takes g6 is ending the game. So that's why after knight f2 here, white resigned because he cannot take back, because then the rook can take, and rook h2 is also coming quickly. So after f5, it's losing already, and the game ended like this. Yeah. Anyway, fantastic game. I really enjoyed going through that. Now I also understand a bit more of all of the details. Without the help of the engine, I just thought I could not really say anything sensible about this game because it was just incredibly complicated. So I thought, usually I'm not really using the engine during the analysis, but I thought today I would make an exception. I hope you guys agree with that and did find some enjoyment in this game. Thought it was pretty cool, and yeah, that was it for today. Let me know if you enjoyed the video. Hit a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't just yet. You can check out my website, felixbroberger.com, for more information. Check out the video description down below in case you want to check out any of my courses, which I did. I'm also going to link the course on the Catalan in the video description down below in case you want to check it out. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.